Does Christianity defy logic? I'm really excited to give you all this presentation because I wish that somebody had given me this presentation like 10 years ago. It just covers some bases that it's not necessarily beginner stuff, it is sort of intermediate type stuff, but I feel like if you give intermediate level stuff to beginners, that it gives them something to aim for instead of just sort of flipping through a whole bunch of different arguments and facts and they're not really sure exactly what they're looking at. So if you give somebody a frame if you give somebody a model that they can start to build their Christian worldview and their Christian apologetic into, it'll make more sense as they progress in learning about all of this stuff. But the key to understanding how you build a Christian worldview in that way is, of course, having some kind of introduction to basic logic. Obviously, you don't hear logic talked about a whole lot in church, which I don't blame them. I don't blame anybody for that. Church is about coming to learn about the Bible. But there are some pretty good principles that are really good to know. And this stuff isn't just for people who study philosophy like me. This is good to know for just anybody, especially in a Western cultural context, because we really take for granted that the way that we think and the way that we process ideas has come down to us over the last 2,500 years since the ancient Greek philosophers were writing their stuff, which is all the stuff that I've been currently reading right now, literally everyone before Socrates. I will not tell you all their names. But it's really fascinating stuff to see how did they begin to start wondering, how do we make sense of the world? Because they had their Greek religions with all their Greek gods and all of that stuff, but what was the first thing that sort of made them start asking questions? And to them, there was no distinction between philosophy and science back then. Today we make that distinction, but to them there wasn't. So they were asking, what is the world made of? Is everything made of the same thing, or is everything made of different stuff? Are we just one thing, or are we many things? So then it's the problem of the one and the many. And that began in approximately, it was in the 500s BC, literally 500 years before Christ. And that logic evolved up into Socrates' time and into Plato's time and then Aristotle. Aristotle was in, I forget exactly when Aristotle lived, it was somewhere in the 300s, I think. I think he died somewhere in the 300s BC. And then, of course, the Roman Empire expanded and took over Israel. So now Israel is in that same thought bubble that the ancient Greek philosophers and the Romans were in. And so that made it really easy when Christianity took off for Christianity to encounter Greek philosophy and basically start to weave some of those ideas in, which is why you have John at the beginning of his gospel referring to Jesus as the Logos, as the Word, who was before the beginning of the world. And that was roughly a concept that the ancient Greek philosophers had invented before that. So a lot of these principles that we're going to talk about now is stuff that these guys came up with back then, and then Christians, starting with about the time of St. Augustine, they started implementing this Greek philosophy into Christian theology, and they sort of got woven together. But these principles of logic that we're going to talk about are applicable to everyone, as I said. So, we are going to talk about, does Christianity defy logic? We're going to talk about certain doctrines. But first we got to go over some basic logic type stuff. So, here we go. First thing you got to know is the laws of logic. Law of logic number one is the law of identity. A is A. It doesn't get much more straightforward than that. A is A. Number 2 is the law of non-contradiction. A is not non-A. So now we have A, and then we have a B. And those two things are not the same things. And then 3 is the law of excluded middle, which is you either have A or you have non-A. So there is something that separates A and B. And again, this is something that we take for granted in the West, in our Western philosophy. But ancient cultures, they may have understood this by some sort of intuition, but we understand it. We could explain what we mean when we say, well, that chair is not that chair. Even though they look exactly the same, they do exactly the same thing, and I can use them for exactly the same thing. They are not the same thing. That chair is that chair, and this chair is this chair. And they're not the same. So we take that for granted. But it's a very important thing to remember. And you might be surprised how often it may come in handy to use these actual definitions, maybe in an argument sometime. You might be surprised. All right, so the next one, getting a little deeper here, are Aristotle's 4 causes. So Aristotle identified 4 different causes that more or less sort of make the world go round. Not literally make the world go round, but you know what I mean. The first one is the efficient cause, which is that by which something comes to be. I'm going to give you an example of how these all work together in just a minute. Number 2 is the formal cause, that of which something comes to be. Number 3 is the material cause, that out of which something comes to be. And number 4 is the final cause, that for which something comes to be. Other philosophers through the centuries have tacked on other causes, supposedly, that you could use. There's also an exemplar cause, which would be like a blueprint. And then there's an instrumental cause, which would be like the tools used to do something. But these are the basic 4 that Aristotle came up with, and they're the most important. So to show you how these work, let's take a rocking chair into consideration. The efficient cause of a rocking chair is the carpenter who made it. He is the one who initiated the cause and effect process that results in the rocking chair. The formal cause of the rocking chair is its form or its essence. And this is something we're not going to get deep into today, because this has to do with Platonic forms and ideas, which is just a whole nother subject on its own. But think of it as the design. Not even the design. It's just the whole of what a rocking chair is. It's the idea of the form of a rocking chair that is the formal cause of it. So in other words, the carpenter has to have some idea of what a rocking chair is when he's creating it. And that idea, that concept, is what he's trying to conform his actual creation to. So the formal cause is its form or its essence. 3 is the material cause. That's easy. It's the wood that it's made out of. And 4, the final cause, is the purpose or the telos, what its function is. So the function of the rocking chair is to sit and rock. It is to sit down and rock on. That is the purpose of the rocking chair. Yeah, efficient cause is that by which, and formal cause is that of which, material cause is that out of which, and the final cause is that for which. And this may all seem rather random at the moment, but I promise I'm going to do something with all this information later. I'm not just saying random things. All right, so the next thing is the principle of sufficient reason. The principle of sufficient reason can be stated in several different ways. You could say that everything must have a cause or a reason. You could say, as Parmenides did, who was a pre-Socratic philosopher, he said, ex nihilo nihil fit, which means out of nothing, nothing comes. Or you could say what Sir William Hamilton said, which was infer nothing without ground or reason. So the idea of the principle of sufficient reason is that everything must have a cause or a reason. One of those, it could have multiple causes in the case of like Aristotle's four causes, or whatever reason it has for existing. For, man-made things have reasons for existing. We make them for a reason. So then, of course, the question becomes, well, can you apply that reasoning to things of nature as well, which is sort of one of those million-dollar questions, right? Again, some people have added causes to Aristotle's four causes. One of those would be a sufficient cause, which would be in line with the principle of sufficient reason to an extent. So a sufficient cause is a cause which must always result in a specific consequent. The consequent being the effect. And that one's a tricky one to use because, as it says, it must always result in that thing. So you're talking about like a chemical reaction that it just has to work that way because for some reason that is how it works. Some people have tried to say, we're not going to get into this tonight, that God is the sufficient cause of the universe. In other words, that God has to create something. He has to create it. He does not have a choice in the matter. That is just his nature. He may have a choice about how it turns out, but he has to do it. That's debatable. I don't agree personally, but again, we're not going there tonight. Another thing to keep in mind is that an effect cannot be greater than its cause. A cause must be equal to or greater than its effect. And we really take this for granted, but I mean, this is where the laws of thermodynamics come in, which is that, an explosion is not going to be bigger than its ingredients can produce. And that is the case with everything that happens. Not just physical cause and effect, but also mental cause and effect to the extent and degree that it functions that way.
How would you go about quantifying the largeness or the greatness of a cause, like a mental cause, something that's not physical?
Mentally, it would be like logical application. I might be able to tie that into I can tie that into the next thing, which is the three types of arguments. There are three types of argumentation, and by that I don't mean arguing with someone about who had the right of way or whose turn it is to clean the bathroom or whatever. I'm not talking about that kind of argument. I'm talking about arguing toward a conclusion, arguing toward a proposition, arguing that a fact is true or correct. And to do this, we use syllogisms. And a syllogism is a formally structured argument with premises and conclusion. So you have premise 1, premise 2, and conclusion. And I'll show you some of those in just a minute. And there's three ways of doing this. The first one is a deductive argument. With deductive arguments, the conclusion must follow the premises. The conclusion follows necessarily, like a math problem. It has to follow because it has that kind of precision. And you can generally think about a deductive argument as arguing from general principles to a particular. And that's why they are that exact, is because if you're arguing that there is some universal principle, then it has to apply to any specific thing within that category. Then there are inductive arguments, which is when the conclusion likely follows from the premises. And this works because you're generally arguing from a particular set of circumstances or data toward a general conclusion that's broad and sweeping. And it's a case-by-case issue where all of the particulars you may not have a way of knowing that all the particulars fit what you're arguing, but you have to argue that it's likely the case, and I'll show you what that is like in a minute. But this would be a case like what you asked just a moment ago, where the effect cannot be greater than the cause. So if you're trying to make a deductive argument where you're arguing from something particular to general, then you've defied the nature of the argument, because you're actually making an inductive argument. And you're going to have a very weak inductive argument if you're trying to argue from something general to particular. That would be a good thing to talk about as a whole subject sometime, is just how to make an argument like that. When I was at GSU, I took a whole class on that. It was a critical thinking class. And I didn't know when I signed up for it that it was going to be basically formal logic, how to make arguments. I was pleasantly surprised when it turned out to be the case, because I ended up, as a student, sort of half teaching the class, because the teacher for that class was himself a graduate student. And he was so overwhelmed in his own studies of Nietzsche, he was very depressed, that he didn't really know how to explain to people. Like, he was just on a different level, and nobody else in that class had ever heard of anything like this before. So it was kind of interesting how that worked. I ended up doing some gospel preaching in that class because it was the only examples I knew how to use. And the third type of argument is abductive arguments. Really, abductive arguments are just a kind of inductive argument, but we use them frequently enough that a lot of teachers and philosophers will list it as an actual third category. An abductive argument is when the conclusion is the most probable conclusion following the premises, or following a set of data, is usually how you do it. If you like watching criminal shows and trying to guess who done it, you're using abductive reasoning. And I'll give you examples of these. So a good example of a deductive argument where the conclusion must necessarily follow the premises is this here. There are many apologetic arguments that work deductively. The trick, of course, is proving the premises, but the point of the argument is that as long as the premises are true, then the conclusion must follow necessarily. And of course, one of my heroes, Dr. William Lane Craig, has used the Kalam cosmological argument to argue for the existence of God to enormous effect. Splendid success, I would say. So the argument goes like this. Premise 1 is everything that begins to exist has a cause. Premise 2 is the universe began to exist. The conclusion, number 3, therefore, the universe has a cause. No arguing with that. You could question one of the premises, but you can't question the form of the argument, because it's a deductive argument and the conclusion must follow. It must. So of course, you might be able to guess which of the premises skeptics attack the most, right? Premise 2, that the universe began to exist, because currently there are all kinds of pseudoscientific theories out there trying to explain. It's like, well, maybe there's a multiverse there's a multiverse generator just out there generating universes, to which your question should then be, well, where did the multiverse generator come from? Or there's string theory, which is that all of the universe expands and contracts continually on an eternal basis, to which your question would be, but where did it come from? All right, examples of an inductive argument. This first inductive argument you probably use every day. Premise 1, the sun has risen every day in the past. Premise 2, therefore, the sun will rise tomorrow. It's a pretty good bet, but it is still a little uncertain, so it is inductive. And again, you are trying to use particular instances of the sun rising every day in the past of human history to a general conclusion that the sun is going to continue rising. We wager that the sun will rise every day because that is a pretty common inductive argument. An inductive argument for biblical inerrancy would go something like this. Premise 1, the Bible claims to be divinely inspired by God, which is a particular claim. Premise 2, God is never wrong, another particular claim. And the conclusion, number 3, therefore, the Bible is never wrong, which is a general conclusion based off of particular premises. So, I created this argument, so there may be a better worded one out there, but that is the basic, wouldn't you say that's pretty much the basic argument for biblical inerrancy?
I don't know how else you would put it.
Yeah. Then, of course, the question becomes, if you're going to talk about biblical inerrancy, what is never wrong, right? Because obviously we have found spelling errors in ancient manuscripts. Does that count as never wrong? Most Christians would say no, of course that doesn't count because it's just a copy that came later. All right, so the best abductive argument that we use in apologetics is, of course, the argument for the resurrection of Jesus, which is an argument from a set of data, and you're trying to conclude what is the best explanation for all of this data. So it is just like a whodunit, except in this case it's not who killed Jesus, it's did Jesus come back to life? Who unkilled Jesus? Which goes like this. The first 5 points are roughly what you could call the minimal facts approach to the resurrection. Jesus was killed and buried in a tomb. We know this as a historical fact. Even historical skeptics of Christianity accept this as a fact. His disciples suffered for their belief in the resurrection. You know, historians are in agreement about that as well. Skeptics of the resurrection became Christians. And by that I mean Paul, who had been persecuting Christians beforehand. And then, of course, there was Jesus' brother James, who ended up becoming a Christian after Jesus was resurrected. The New Testament seems to be historically reliable. There's lots of good examples and evidence, little things in the New Testament that seem to indicate that it is historically reliable. It's never been proven wrong. And number 5 is a little more contestable, but that the tomb was empty. The tomb was actually empty. Otherwise, it would have been fairly easy to just walk in and grab Jesus' body and say, no, he's not risen, he's right there. So the conclusion we draw from all of that is that Jesus rose from the dead. That is an abductive argument. Of course, that is literally like 5 presentations all on its own. All right, so now that we have covered some logical bases, I've given you a basic logical rundown of how the laws of logic work and Aristotle's 4 causes and the 3 types of arguments and the principle of sufficient reason, you're now smarter than about half of Western civilization. And if you were already there, now you're smarter than the next 25%. Especially if you can actually explain it to them. And it's good, if you deal with these ideas all the time, the words just start to come to you. You say, okay, that's an inductive argument, that's a deductive argument. Okay, you're talking about a material cause, you're not talking about a formal cause, that sort of thing. Oh, you're using the law of non-contradiction, and you don't even know it. So we're going to talk about these 4 doctrines. Now, again, all 4 of these doctrines that we're going to talk about, the Incarnation, creation out of nothing, predeterminism versus free will, and the Trinity, these could be discussions of their own, because they're very difficult topics But what I want to emphasize is that we're not necessarily tonight looking for the explanation for how this works, for how these things work. What we're just looking at is the logic behind it. Because what I'm going to argue and demonstrate to you, hopefully, is that the logic behind these doctrines is pretty watertight. Now, how you explain exactly how these things work, that's another matter, obviously, because there's some things that concern the supernatural world that perhaps we don't really have answers to. But as far as we're concerned on earth, just using the noggins that God gave us and the laws of logic that God created for us to use, we can show that these things are, in fact, logical to believe in. And I have tried to arrange these in order of difficulty, so we're going to start with what I think is probably the easiest and then work our way to the hardest. Although I just realized I may have switched two of them. So I'll be surprised. But the first one is definitely the Incarnation, which of course is the doctrine that Jesus is and always has been God, but he became a man. Jesus is both equally God and equally man. So the second person of the Trinity, the Son, has always existed with God in eternity as God, but he became incarnate and was born as a human baby and grew up as a man and lived a human life. And we like to say that Jesus is both equally God and equally man. So, just as John 1:14 says, the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. The Word became flesh and dwelt among us. 1 Timothy 3:16 says, God was manifested in the flesh. And of course, this would be devastating to the Gnostics who were trying to say that God would never inhabit flesh because flesh is dirty and filthy and sinful and imperfect and could never host the holy divine creator of the universe. But the fact of the matter is this is what the Bible says happened with Jesus. Jesus came in the flesh. So, is the Incarnation illogical? What's the problem here? The problem is, two problems. How can Jesus be an infinite God and a finite man? How can he be a God who is unlimited in his essence, but also a man who is limited in his essence? And number two, how can God know everything? How can God be omniscient, but Jesus didn't know everything? So in Mark 13:32, Jesus says, "But of that day and hour, no one knows, not even the angels in heaven, nor the Son, but only the Father." Of course, he's talking about when the second coming is going to happen, when Jesus is going to return to earth. So, how could Jesus not know the answer to that question? How can he be omniscient if he's not? All right, let's deal with the first one first. The answer to the first question being, how can Jesus be an infinite God and a finite man? The answer is that, well, Jesus did not transform his essence as God, but simply added flesh to himself. As Dr. Norman Geisler, the famed Dr. Norman Geisler, said, in the Godhead there is one what and three whos. That's the Trinity. But in Christ there is one who and two whats. That's probably about as simple as you could put it. So in other words, it's not that God in his infinitude changed himself into a finite being. It's more like God took on the fleshly form. You could almost think of it It's not quite a proper analogy, but you could almost think of it as a hand in a glove, where Jesus' earthly body is merely one extension of who the Son is infinitely. You wouldn't want to take that analogy too far, but that is the basic idea. So that is not illogical. That, again, we don't understand exactly how God works because we're not well acquainted with the spiritual realm. We're not well acquainted with the abilities of God to the fullest extent. But this answer and the doctrine itself does evade being illogical in the sense that it's not saying that God's eternity and his infiniteness somehow became temporal and finite. It didn't work quite that way. Our second problem was, how can God know everything, but Jesus didn't know everything? So to that problem, we can ask this question. Well, what is the sufficient reason for God's omniscience? The problem with Jesus not knowing everything is that we believe that God does know everything. So using, if you recall, the principle of sufficient reason, which is that everything has to have a reason, what is the sufficient reason for God's omniscience? The sufficient reason is that God created all knowledge. God possesses all knowledge. And so when we start with that basic fact, we can actually create an inductive argument for Jesus' limited human knowledge, starting with that fact that God possesses all knowledge already. And premise 2 is, if God can create humans, he can create a human body for himself. Obviously, he created our human bodies, so why couldn't he create a human body for himself? And we already answered the logic of that with our first answer. Premise 3 is, well, human bodies can only possess a limited amount of knowledge. So if God is creating a human body for himself, he doesn't have to create it in such a way where Jesus' earthly body somehow has to be able to retain all knowledge in the universe that God has. There may be some reason why God would want to restrict his knowledge temporarily in the case of Jesus. So, using these premises, we can come to the conclusion, therefore, God's human body can only possess limited knowledge, even though his eternal mind possesses all knowledge. And I would even go so far as to say, there's different theories about what has now happened to Jesus' body now that he has ascended to heaven. Is his actual physical body actually in heaven, wherever heaven is? Or has his physical body dissolved until some later time? I am undecided on that question there. But if we imagine that Jesus' resurrected, glorified body is existing somewhere in the state of heaven, wherever it is, it's still very possible that he can only, that his body at least can only function by thinking one thing at a time, just like ours, probably to a more fuller extent. He probably uses 100% of his brain. But it's very possible that he still only has that limited scope of mental ability, being that his body is still finite to some extent. Unless resurrected, glorified bodies function in a different way that we just don't understand yet. It could be that our limited knowledge is a product of the fall of man, that is. So I'm sure there are probably Calvinists in the room who might agree with that.
Question.
Sure.
So is God's knowledge, his infinite knowledge, necessary to his nature as God?
is God's infinite knowledge necessary
Omniscience is that
to his
necessary
omniscience?
his nature? Because if he puts on a human skin, then if that's still necessary, wouldn't it still need to be necessary while he's in a human body for him to still be God?
Well, I would say that that's probably a categorical error to make that assumption, which is what this argument would be for demonstrating, which is that God's infinite knowledge exists in his mind, his being somewhere, but God's mind and being is only functioning finitely and temporally within the body of Jesus, in which case he only has access to what he has access to for whatever reason that the Father has granted him access to whatever, or he's given himself access to whatever. So I would say that God's omniscience is necessary to his essence, but I don't think that it's necessary to Jesus's earthly body. I guess that would be my answer to that.
Okay. Also, just another thing, do you think Jesus had a human mind, or is it just the eternal mind in the human body? Because I know that kind of gets into Christology.
That is another difficult subject.
Okay.
In other words, did Jesus have a human spirit, a human soul, or was he God himself wearing the body of Christ? That's another one I am personally undecided on, and I don't feel like offending anyone today. More than necessary. But that is a great question, and one I would love to get an answer to. I suspect that if I had a guess, just an intuitive guess, I would say that Jesus probably did, in fact, have a human spirit and a human soul, and that he probably grew up that way until a certain time in his life when it could have been when he was baptized that the Holy Spirit came upon him and he sort of received the fullness of his essence then and there, still functioning as a human, of course, but it's just a guess.
Okay.
I am just rattling off heresies right now. All right, so the next topic. Creation ex nihilo. Creatio ex nihilo. Creation out of nothing. Which is the doctrine that God brought space, time, and matter into existence without using prior materials. God created the materials that he used to create the universe. This is a biblical doctrine. Genesis 1:1, which was my dad's favorite Bible verse. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. My dad once gave a 2-hour presentation on this one verse alone. It was magnificent. Hebrews 11:3 says, "By faith we understand that the worlds were framed by the word of God, so that the things which are seen were not made of things which are visible." And of course we could debate about, well, what does not visible mean? Are there invisible ingredients that God used? But again, we're not going into the specific metaphysics of these problems, just focusing on the logic of it. So, is creation out of nothing illogical? 2 problems. How can something come from nothing? This is also quite an acute problem for atheists and naturalists, because in their case they have to explain what nothing is. How could nothing cause nothing but cause the universe? And sometimes it's funny how they try to answer this question because they imagine a void filled with energy. And you're like, wait a second. Energy is not nothing. Where did the energy come from? Like, no, you have to start with a void in naturalism. Problem number 2, well, how does anything exist at all? If we just imagine for a moment that okay, the materials are there, Well, how are things just holding together? How is everything just continuing to exist as it is? This is a pretty sufficient problem in and of itself. All right, so for the first problem, how can something come from nothing? The answer is, well, according to Christianity, it doesn't. This may feel like a trick, but the principle of sufficient reason states that everything must have a reason, and in Christianity, the reason for the universe is God. Creatio ex nihilo doesn't mean that nothing existed before the universe, only that the universe itself was not made from prior materials. From a logical and scientific standpoint, the Christian is not necessarily in a position where they have to explain where God got the materials, how God generated the materials. We are in a position where we can simply say, well, we believe that God created it. And, well, how does anything exist at all? This is the second problem. Well, if space-time and matter are the consequent, if space-time and matter are the effect, then their cause must be equal to or greater than them. Remember that rule? I told you that rule. So therefore, their cause must be spaceless, timeless, and immaterial, which sounds like God. And if everything needs an efficient cause, which it does, based on the principle of sufficient reason, the efficient cause is that by which something is caused, then space, time, and matter need an efficient cause. But if the efficient cause of space, time, and matter has to be greater than space, time, and matter, and greater than the physical laws of the universe by which the universe functions, then the only other option is a mind, because there are only two kinds of causes in the world. One is physical causes, and the other is mental causes. Now, of course, scientists try to argue that mental causes are really just a product of physical circumstances. But that's debatable. They haven't been able to prove that, because correlation is not causation. So therefore, it is logical that that creation out of nothing, meaning no prior materials, was initiated by a spaceless, timeless, and matterless, immaterial mind. So, is everybody doing good? All right, because now we're going to step it up. The Trinity. Yeah, these are the two I swapped. At the very last minute, I swapped the Trinity and predeterminism versus free will. Mostly because of the arguments you need to use. The argumentation for the last one is a little longer, but the Trinity is certainly probably the biggest mystery in terms of Christian doctrine. It's certainly a doctrine that's peculiar to Christianity. We're the only religion that has anything like this at all. So, of course, the Trinity is the doctrine that God is three persons and one essence, and each person is as equally God as the others. And I'm going to explain why that matters in a moment. We find this in the Bible implicitly, though, of course, the word Trinity is not used in the Bible. But the doctrine is indeed present in the Bible, and I couldn't possibly list all the verses for you right now, but for sure, we see it in Matthew 28:19. Go therefore and make disciples of all the nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit. Jesus is saying this as part of the Great Commission. This is the Great Commission. And he is equating these three. You do have to understand the Greek a bit to understand how that works, linguistically, of course, but that is what Jesus is doing. And Jesus himself said in John 10:30, I and my Father are one. And then Paul says in 2 Corinthians 13:14, the grace of the Lord Jesus Christ and the love of God and the communion of the Holy Spirit be with you all. And again, we could get into the Greek here, but the Greek word for Lord is a Greek transliteration of the Hebrew word, it might be Jehovah. Jehovah is occasionally translated in the Old Testament into the word Lord. Well, that's what's going on. Every time they say Lord Jesus Christ, they are calling, in the New Testament, every time they call Jesus Christ Lord, they are calling him God, because it's the word is the Greek equivalent of the Hebrew word that means the same thing, which is Jehovah or Yahweh, one of those. I think the potential problem with the Trinity is obvious. Doesn't the Trinity defy the law of non-contradiction? How can three be one? One is one, three is three. One is not three, three is not one. That's the law of non-contradiction. What are you foolish Christians talking about? So how do we begin, without having access to the actual metaphysical, spiritual answer to God's essence, how God exists as three persons in one essence? Without that, how do we even begin to approach the logic? Well, the questionist just assumes the wrong thing. And it might feel like sort of a cheap way out, but the fact is that, well, the Trinity does not actually defy the law of non-contradiction, because the Trinity claims to be one essence. God is God, not non-God. God is God, not non-God. So whatever the essence of God is, whatever is not God does not belong in the essence of God. What you do with the essence of God isn't going to defy the law of non-contradiction, because we're still defining it as God himself. So then, how do you relate the... Do you have a question?
Well, I was going to make a comment, because I've talked to people about this before. Are any of y'all much familiar with quantum mechanics? If you start in the field of quantum mechanics, you start seeing things in nature that reflect similar ideas. So I think the most simple one you could use is particle wave duality of light, right? Oh. So light is a particle and a wave. It is one essence, it is light, but it has different forms, different ways of looking at it. But it's still light and it's still one thing, but it's a particle and it's a wave. It can act two ways, but its essence is one.
Right. I'm going to have to look more into that.
Yeah.
I think I've heard that before. People use that to try to explain the Trinity. And I have some other analogies that we're going to look at that are not good. But that one sounds right. But I don't understand light enough to know if it's good or not. But I will definitely look up that one, because that is fascinating. That is one of our mysteries. That's one of those mysteries of the universe we just take for granted. It's like light behaves as a particle and a wave. Why? Why does gravity work? It's the same thing. Why? The more mass there is, the more it sucks you in. Why is that a thing? Okay, so what do we do with the three persons inside the Trinity? There's a few things we can try. And I got this picture off of Facebook, and I really, really like it because it's just so well organized. So these are 4 heresies of trying to explain what the Trinity is and how it works. And there are various Christian denominations, quote unquote Christian denominations, that hold to these different perspectives. We could talk about whether or not that affects their salvation or their Christian theology, maybe some other time. But the first one of these is tritheism, where you literally just have 3 gods. They are 3 separate beings who have just sort of come together and declared themselves to be the one office of divinity. They are God. But that does not fit the biblical data. Then there is partialism, which is that each of the three are each a part of God, and together they form the whole. And perhaps they have all existed from eternity, but for example, the things that the Father knows and does are not the things that the Son knows and does. And you can see how Jesus not knowing certain things when he was on earth might lead to some of this. It would make sense for somebody to look at that and say, okay, well, that just means that the Son knows things that the Father doesn't, and the Father knows things that the Son doesn't. Seems to make sense. Problem is again, that doesn't really fit the biblical data, and it also doesn't work very well philosophically. So you have to do something with it. Then there is modalism, which is that there is just one God with one mind, but he is sort of taking turns playing three different roles. So one minute he's the Father, and the next minute he's the Son, and then he's the Holy Spirit. But again, this doesn't really match the biblical data, especially in a circumstance where all three of them are present at the same time, like at Jesus' baptism. Jesus is there in the river. The Father is up in heaven, and he says, "This is my beloved Son." And then the Holy Spirit descends upon him. So they're all three there at the same time. Although, a modalist could still argue that it's still one God doing all three at the same time, but again, doesn't quite match the biblical data. And then there's just Arianism, which is just awful. Whoever came up with it is just not smart at all, which is what?
Real heathen.
Right, a real heathen.
At least he got punched by St. Nicholas.
Right. The Arianism is that Jesus is a created being by God, which would be, if I am not mistaken, is the doctrine of Jehovah's Witnesses. They believe that Jesus essentially functions as our Lord and Savior and our God, but he hasn't always existed. All right, but of course the Orthodox view is that there is one God who eternally exists in three persons, all of whom are fully God, all of whom are equal. So it's not modalism in the sense that one God is sort of performing as three gods, and it's not partialism in that they are all a different segment of God. It is that they have always existed in eternity as the three persons. And once again, I'll say this once again, we are not trying to explain the metaphysics of how this works, only the logic of it. All right, so you can see how this one is a little more difficult than the last two. A good bit more difficult, actually. So this is the other problem then. Well, how can each person of the Trinity be equally God? It's easier to imagine how there can be three in one, but the easiest ways to imagine that end up being heresies that don't fit the biblical data. So then, what do we do with it? So, people have tried to come up with analogies for how this works. So here are some bad analogies. My apologies to St. Patrick, but he should have known better. The shamrock is not a good example, having three clovers, because it represents partialism. Also, that pizza has the same problem. The bread, the sauce, the cheese, it's partialism. There are three ingredients making up a whole. It just doesn't work that way. Water is a very common analogy that you will probably hear youth pastors use. Youth pastors also love pizza, but water, of course, is one thing. It's one chemical substance, but it takes three forms: liquid, solid, and vapor. But it has to do those things at different times, which makes it modalism. And if you said that, well, no, if you imagine all the water in the world, there's some ice and there's some liquid and there's some vapor, well, that's just partialism again. So
just can't win with the water.
No, you can't win with water. A slightly better example would be a family man. It is one person who is a father, a son, and an uncle. Now, we're not going to get into accidental properties, which is a philosophical concept, meaning the properties you only possess in relation to other things. But this is still modalism, and the reason is because you can only be a father to one set of people, or just one person. You can only be a son to two people, and you can only be an uncle to one set of people as well. And even though you may be able to do those things simultaneously, you are not as equally an uncle to your parents, only in Alabama, but you are not equally an uncle to your parents. It just doesn't work that way. So what we still have here is modalism. All right, so I've left you in suspense then. What are we left with? What can we possibly use? What is the best analogy for the Trinity? The laws of logic. Because the laws of logic, the three laws of logic, are not actually three. They are just one law, stated three different ways. The law of non-contradiction. A is not non-A. A and B must be divided by something other than themselves, which is also something that Parmenides said. That's the second time I've used Parmenides tonight. You can tell I've been studying. But it's actually one law. Like, the reason that you can say that A is because you hypothetically assume that there is probably a non-A out there somewhere. So you can't say A is A without presuming that there's some defining environmental factor that restricts A to being what it is. But also, when you say that A is not non-A, you assume that there is something in between them that divides them. And obviously, that thing that divides two things is itself differentiated from those other two things. So the three laws of logic are really one law, which is why you most frequently hear people just refer to it as the law of non-contradiction. Sort of the same way that you only ever mention the second law of thermodynamics, because they're all very similar, and the second one sort of just encapsulates all of it. But I don't know enough about that to use that as an example. But the laws of logic, for sure, I think, is probably the best analogy you're going to get. The only problem that this might present is you end up not with one of those four particular heresies, but you could come up with some version. You could come up with a very relativistic version of modalism, where you say, well, when I relate to God in this way, I'm relating to the Father. Or when I relate to God this way, I'm relating to Him as Jesus. And when I relate to God this way, I'm relating to Him as the Holy Spirit. So that it's one thing seen from three different angles. So it still doesn't quite go all the way, but I think that it is as close and as good as you're going to get, because each law of logic is equal in meaning and power to all the others. And they are essentially just one. All right, we're 3 out of 4 now. Now on to the more difficult one, if you can imagine. More difficult than the Trinity is going to be predeterminism versus free will. I want to say up front, and I want to make sure that we're clear about this, we are not talking about predestination versus free will. That is a totally different subject. That is the subject of soteriology, which is subject of salvation. How we are saved and our relationship to God before salvation and after salvation. That topic is certainly related to this one, but it's sort of that subject of soteriology is built on top of this foundation of predeterminism versus free will. And I'm going to explain to you sort of where the handoff occurs. You'll see in just a moment. So predeterminism, as opposed to predestination would be that God chooses you for salvation. But predeterminism is a bigger idea. Predeterminism is the idea that all events are caused by God himself. God just is playing with us like his toys, like his action figures, like I used to play with my action figures. So that is what predeterminism is. And of course, free will is the idea that persons can choose between two options without being manipulated or influenced. You can make a conscientious choice between two things. And we see these two things in the Bible. In Proverbs 21:1 says, "The king's heart is in the hand of the Lord. Like the rivers of water, he turns it wherever he wishes." So this seems to imply some kind of predeterminism. And I was very careful to pick verses that didn't deal with salvation here. All we're talking about here is the actions of a king. This verse says that the Lord turns the king's heart wherever he wishes. And but in 2 Samuel 24:12, we explicitly have God saying to King David, "I offer you 3 things. Choose one of them for yourself, that I may do it to you." So, does God turn the king's heart wherever he wishes, or does God give the king choices? Of course, the context of the 2 Samuel verse is the story of King David deciding to have a census of all of Israel, which apparently God did not like. So when the prophet, I think it was Gad, came to David and said that God was displeased with David, David immediately repented. He said, "I have sinned. What do I do?" And that's when God tells Gad to tell David that, "Thus says the Lord, I offer you 3 things. Choose one of them for yourself, that I may do it to you." And all 3 options were pretty awful punishments. But you can read all about that yourself. What we're dealing with here is the logic of all of this. All right, so the problem here is pretty obvious. How can humans have free will if God is controlling everything? Well, there are some options for how we deal with this logically. There are some philosophical options. I've listed at least 4 here. The first one is total predeterminism, which is that God causes, moves, and controls everything, and that free will is just an illusion. I should have put that there, but yeah. Free will is just an illusion because God is just doing it all himself. He's just doing whatever he wants, and he's making us move and making us think and even making us sin. I went out on a date one time with a Calvinist girl who told me that she believed that God caused Adolf Hitler to initiate the Holocaust.
It's a rough first date comment.
It really is.
I want to see an icebreaker, though.
Fortunately, we were eating ice cream. So, no, we did not have a second date. But
Determined it was not meant.
also, no, I'm not going to tell the rest of that story. But anyway, second option, things to edit out of the recording. Second option would be open theism. This is a bad word in theology. Don't say this in church. Open theism, which is that God does not know the future, but reacts to human actions and works toward achieving his purposes. It doesn't mean that God doesn't still have his will. His will is that everybody comes to know him and goes to heaven, and he's going to build his kingdom, and there's still going to be a second coming of Christ and all of that. But God doesn't know the future. And sometimes an open theist will argue this by saying that God has purposefully restricted his knowledge from himself in order to give people free will, or they will say that it is literally illogical and impossible to know the future at all, and even God himself cannot do something that is logically impossible. I'm not going to tell you which one of those is the better version of open theism, because it doesn't match the biblical data. The Bible seems to indicate that God knows everything, and he knows everything that's going to happen in the future. Otherwise, there are a lot of prophecies that wouldn't make much sense unless God actually knew what was going to happen. Obviously, some of them are self-fulfilled. Like if God says that he's going to send a Messiah, and then he sends a Messiah, obviously that's a self-fulfilled prophecy. But if he says something like, the Babylonians are going to fall to this or that kingdom, and then it actually happens without any hint of God causing it to happen, then that seems to show that God actually knew what was going to happen. All right, so third option is compatibilism. Third option is compatibilism, which is also sometimes called soft determinism, meaning it's not quite as rock solid as predeterminism or determinism, but it's just a little mushier, which is that humans have free will. They do indeed have free will, but their choices are predetermined by external factors. So you do have a free will, but you didn't really have a choice in how it operates, because the world around you influences you to make those decisions. And that is as opposed to libertarian free will. Libertarian free will, which is also called incompatibilism, because it's not compatibilism, it's incompatibilism, of course, is that human free will is not subject to external influences except what limits the choice itself. So in other words, I don't have the choice right now to take off and fly like Superman because I don't have that ability. But I do have a choice, an actual choice right now, whether or not to just leave all my stuff here and go for a jog and leave the donuts to y'all. So, and I think that the difference between compatibilism and libertarian free will is a little more nuanced than most people think, because in both cases, the external world has the ability to influence you. But the difference is that in compatibilism, it works like free will would be subject to like physical laws of science, like a chemical reaction, where you are guaranteed to do this thing because that is what the external factors have deemed. Even though you do have the function of free will, it's a function that is subject to the things that it's connected to, essentially. But in libertarian free will, even though there are things that can influence you, like there can be peer pressure on you to do drugs, you are still making that choice yourself. You've just granted that the peer pressure is more important than your health or whatever. So that's the nuanced difference between those. So right off the bat, we can eliminate total predeterminism because it doesn't fit the biblical data, just doesn't seem to fit the biblical data. If there's any verse in the Bible that suggests that God has given anybody a choice, even just once in the whole course of history, then total predeterminism is out. We can also go ahead and toss out open theism because it just doesn't fit the biblical data. There seems to be biblical evidence that God does in fact know the future, and I already talked about that. So we're left with the last two, compatibilism or libertarian free will. So which one of these could we say is more compatible with the Bible? And the answer is, they're both compatible with the Bible. The fact of the matter is that biblical verses about whether it be determinism or free will or predestination or election really are mostly subject to what you already think about these two subjects right here. Whether you already have a predisposition toward compatibilism or libertarian free will for whatever reason. And whatever you think about these two subjects, and whichever one you prefer, is going to affect how you color those Bible verses that deal with predestination and free will, as well as your view of the noetic effects of the fall of man, which is how the fall affected your mental abilities, as well as your spiritual abilities and all of that. So then, if they're both compatible with the Bible then, which is, I will admit, that is my assertion. This is a Duran original here tonight. This is my assertion that compatibilism and libertarian free will are both compatible with the Bible. So you have to come to a determination first which of these two philosophies are true in and of themselves before you can begin to have a proper understanding of the Bible. So then how can we tell which one is true then? And what I'm going to argue for you tonight is that the very existence and usage of logic favors libertarian free will. And I offer you this thought experiment as proof. Imagine you're solving a math problem. Don't imagine you're doing homework, because with homework you are compelled to get the answer right. You have some kind of external pressure forcing you to get this question right. But imagine that you've just decided that it's your day off and you want to solve a math problem. So you decide to try to solve 2 + 2, which of course the correct answer is 4. So if you were just doing this for whatever reason you're doing it, what could make you answer this question incorrectly? An option might be somebody has a gun to your head and they say, don't you dare write 4. Or there may be peer pressure saying, no man, writing 4 is not cool anymore. Kids aren't doing that these days. Or maybe your parents, I don't know, trained you to add 1 to everything, so you're really tempted to write 5, even though you know that the correct answer is 4 somehow. But the fact of the matter is, if you can answer that question, what could make you answer this question incorrectly? If you could accurately state the very thing that could make you answer that question incorrectly, then you've just demonstrated your libertarian free will. Because if you can identify the thing that is persuading you to make your choice or not make your choice, then what you've done is you've proven that your choice really does exist and that it is not totally under the control of outside pressures and influences. Does that make sense?
So the way my dad always put it is that we are given the freedom to make our own choices, but the results of all of our choices are known and accounted for. So would you say that accurately fits into the libertarian free will method? Or I guess.
Yes, absolutely. That's why I put, but God is still God. So the fact of the matter is that God is going to accomplish His will by doing what He may. If He wants to take over the decision-making process of a person, then what He is doing then is He is He's performing a miracle, is what He's doing, because He's overcoming the standard rule of libertarian free will. He's interfering in that case. And of course, Dr. Youssef gave a pretty good example this morning talking about Pharaoh. He said, well, if you read the whole story, at first, Pharaoh hardens his heart. And then Pharaoh hardens his heart again. And then Pharaoh hardens his heart again. And then all of a sudden, God steps in, and it's God is hardening his heart. God hardens his heart. God hardens his heart. Now, whatever God's reason for doing that may be, the fact of the matter is that at the very beginning, Pharaoh was making his own choice. And of course, Pharaoh is probably under a bunch of pressure to impress whoever he has to impress. But he still has to make his choice about whether or not to obey God and let the Hebrews go free. But then at some point, God decides, okay, well, you have defied me enough times now that your punishment is going to be that you no longer have a choice. And I think that that's pretty valid punishment. You no longer have a choice. And, I would have to think if maybe God's used that one on me at some point. But I have to dwell on that. But I think that that's a more likely scenario than the idea that God starts off predetermining what all of our decisions are going to be and then miraculously interjecting free will decisions. It seems to me that it makes more sense, at least from our logical perspective of the world, that what we have is essentially libertarian free will, and God is still going to use our choices to fulfill his will, probably in ways we don't fully understand. But I think that there is some truth to, I will throw a bone to Molinism here, I think that there is probably some truth to Molinism, which is that God has middle knowledge, meaning God has knowledge of the things that would have happened if you made a different choice. Naturally, God does have knowledge of what could happen if you make a different choice, but he also has knowledge of what would have happened. And by God having this knowledge, he can put you in a situation where the only choices that you have are still going to fulfill his will no matter what you choose, even if it has to go the long way around or the short way. But that is still in accordance with libertarian free will, because all that means is that God's limited your choices. He hasn't caused you to make that choice, except of course in matters where we clearly have examples of God making those choices. So if you consider this again with the verse that said that God turns the king's heart wherever he wishes, notice that verse doesn't tell us how God does it. It's because of the language that we automatically imagine God like playing puppeteer with the king or possessing the king and using him as a hand puppet to just issue decrees. But the verse doesn't give us that much information. And actually, if you think harder about the analogy that's used in that verse where God is turning the river, or he's turning the king's heart as he turns a river, well, how do you turn a river? You have to affect the land. You have to affect the boundaries within which the river can run. So if God is simply affecting the boundaries of where our free will can actually run, then that is still libertarian free will. It is not technically compatibilism. Although some compatibilists will probably say that no, that's still compatibilism because God is predetermining your choices based on external criteria. But the difference is that with compatibilism, you have a God who is literally guiding every single decision you make one by one by one by one by one, whereas libertarian free will provides a broader, whereas compatibilism is very narrow, libertarian free will provides a broad base for people to make decisions within a universe capable of hosting these free will decisions. But by limiting the environment and the situations, God can still drive history toward the ends that he's designed for it. All he has to do is narrow the end of it, not all of it, you see.
Would predeterminists try to argue something like it's still predetermined because, let's say, like, I don't know, I'm choosing what breakfast cereal I want in the morning, and I'm trying to choose between Trix or Cheerios, but instead I decide to go buy a gun and shoot my friend Jim in the head. So obviously there has to be
dramatic difference. That's why you don't get guns in cereal boxes anymore.
No. Or the good old days. Those days.
What was your question again?
No, I was just trying to say, like, when somebody tried, like, I was trying to figure out where I was going with it, but like, they would still argue that it's predetermined as opposed to total free will because the number of choices that we have are limited, per se, as opposed to.
Well, the difference again is that there's a difference between affecting the choices that you have, the options that you have, and affecting the choice that you make.
Right.
Affecting the choice that you make is predeterminism, whereas libertarian free will is that the options are there, but the options, however God does his thing, are going to lead eventually to the same thing, more or less. If his universal will came down to you either eating cereal or shooting someone, which may not be the case. From here, what you would say is once you've determined that libertarian free will, here's the kicker. This isn't as exciting to an Arminian like me as you might think. You could still be a Calvinist and believe in libertarian free will. Because the issue of salvation and the noetic effects of the fall, whether or not we are subject to total depravity or not, that is going to be a matter of sin and theology, so to speak, so that you could still believe that we are incapable of seeking after God specifically, and that God has to literally revive our dead souls on the spot before we could ever hope to come to him. That could still be the case. We may not have the option of coming to God. That may not be one of the broad options available to us if the noetic effects of the sin work that way, if that's how they work. But that comes down to how you interpret the Bible and not how you arrive at the broader philosophy of how these things work. On the other hand, too, I think that you may be able to say, I think it'd be hard to find, but you could probably find an Arminian who subscribed to compatibilism. Probably could find one. But obviously, like I said, the discussion about whether or not Calvinism or Arminianism is true is a totally different discussion. And it rests on top of this issue here, which is just a purely philosophical and logical issue. So, are predeterminism and free will compatible? Sort of. And that's why this one's just a little more difficult, I think, than the Trinity to swallow and digest. I think that this issue is, I think this issue keeps more people awake at night because it's very personal. It's like, do I really have a choice? How do I relate to God in this way? All right, so, after all that, here's the last slide. So, is Christianity illogical? No. On the contrary, Christianity is the most logical worldview. Because if you think about all of the things we've just discussed, if you think about the Incarnation, what the Incarnation demonstrates is that God has the ability to interact with his creation, which people haven't always believed that. But God can interact with his creation by some means. And creation out of nothing demonstrates that it's more logical to believe that God is the efficient cause of the universe than that the universe just exists in and of itself, because then there's no explanation. With the Trinity, obviously, I think that the Trinity is even a more logical way to conceive of God, because if you just have a single God, what you have is a God who ultimately ends up being, again, the law of non-contradictions, they all work together. If there is A, then there has to be non-A as well. That's the implication. So if God is, and he says, I am that I am, then that implies that there is something else. But also predeterminism versus free will, we see that the Bible gives us evidence of this. And I think that, of course, I think other religious holy books probably give us a picture of humans making many more free will decisions, and that the thing that really is strange about the Bible in comparison with those is that the Bible really does show us a God who is in control in a very special way. So in that regard, I think that you can say, considering all four of these doctrines, that Christianity is literally the most logical worldview, certainly more logical than the other worldviews that we have available to us.